Chapter 3 of Deadwood Dick's Doom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Kristen Hughes. Deadwood Dick's Doom, or Calamity Jane's Last Adventure, by Edward L. Wheeler. Chapter 3. The Stranger Sings. Hank Shakespeare was one of the ruling spirits of Death Notch, inasmuch as he was the bully all over, and always ripe for a quarrel or a spree. One by one he had worsted each of the residents of the town, down to the captain, Paiute Dave, in a fair and square fight, and that fact had by no means lessened his esteem of his own prowess, so that he was never backward about waltzing right into a quarrel. His word, next to that of Paiute Dave, was regarded as law, and the majority of the roughs would have followed him in case of a split rather than the captain, who was of even a worse disposition than his bulldog companion, for he was ever too ready to draw a weapon and shoot down a fellow at little or no offence. Therefore, when Shakespeare proposed to have a concert from the newly arrived songsters, no one offered demur thereat, bemused to arouse the ire of the burly bull-whacker, was to give the signal for a fight from the word go. Therefore, after supper, a gang headed by the festive Shakespeare, who had imbibed more bootlegs than was good for acute locomotion, made a precipitate descent into the poker-house, and ordered the drinks, while the poet, with his smile in hand, mounted the deal-table nearest the bar, and addressed the uncouth assemblage around him. "Feller citizens, noble representatives of the moral town of Death Notch, it becomes my duty to rise in front of ye like a bellowin' buffler bull ter make an announcement. Ay, my noble guzzlers, I've a great bit o' news for ye. We're on the eve o' a great event. We have in our midst a human phenomenon, as Shakespeare senior said, a maiden fair with voice like a dreamer. She sings and she plays. She's a regular screamer. Yes, ye long-eared pilgrims, your humble servant jest made the diskivery that Sarah Bernhardt Nilsson, the famous singer, is here in Death Notch, she who has appeared afore all their crowned heads of Europe and Ethiopia. And what do yer think, my noble councilmen and taxpayers? What do ye surmise this distinguished singist proposes to do? Why, thunderation, sirs, she calculates to give our critical city of Death Notch their death shake, and not open her vocal bugle short o' hellin' her. Now then, my prickly pears of the desert, I rise to promulgate the extemporaneous question, are we to be snubbed like this? Are we to be cheated out of hearin' their singest vocalize in our own aristocratic sphere? I say no. In clarion notes I scream nay. Some immortal poet in past ages has said very scientifically, it pleases mortal man ter feast, music alone ter soothe their savage beast. And here's the very beast as requires music to anoint the ragged volcano edge of his erupted bosom. What d'ye ray, galoots? We invite their gal to favor us with some of her fust-class tunes?" A cheer was the answer. The idea was favored by all that rough assemblage. "Then will I fotch forth their great warbler from her conservatory?" the bull-whacker cried, and leaping from the table, and drawing a pair of revolvers, he left the room. Up the stairs, two at a time, he went and rapped at the door of Miss Verner's room peremptorily. The young woman opened it in great surprise, her face paling as she saw the great gaunt bull-whacker. "'Scuse me, mum," he said, bowing, "but ye see, the bees have found out that you're a singist, and they allow that their likeliest thing ye can do is to come down and sing for 'em. They're dead for music, and though they're rather a rough lot, if ye sing your purtiest, and they're nigger too, I opine you'll be all right." "Oh, sir, you must excuse me," Virgie cried in distress. "I cannot sing to-night. Really I cannot." "But you must, mum. You see how their boys are all on the squee-vive to hear ye vocalize, and appointed me as a delegate to represent 'em, and say if you don't waltz down and sing for 'em, I am to shoot ye on the spot. You perceive we're old business, we daisies of Death Notch. When a mule gets balky, we always drap 'em out without any preliminary parley. That for, we allow that if you edify us with a few songs, and the nigger too,
Your safety will be an assured fact, and if ye don't, we'll hev ter spec for a parson to preach your funeral sermon, termorrer."
"Oh, Nick, what shall we do?" Miss Verner said, turning to the darky, pale and trembling. "What shall we do?"
"Spec's de best ting we can do is to give 'em some music, rather dan get de top of our heads blowed off. Brest is ya, Charles, ef he's gwine to git in trouble, when de banjo will git him out. Just you get your guitar, Miss Virginie, and I's a raccoon if we can't stir 'em up."
"Perhaps you are right, Nick, but I wish we had never come here," the girl said as she procured a handsome guitar from her trunk. And then she and the darky, who was armed with a banjo, followed the bullwhacker down the stairs into the crowded bar-room. A loud cheer greeted their advent from the ruffian assemblage, among whom were many of the most bold and lawless desperadoes on the border, men who had waded in crime and ruffianism all their lives, and had lost all sense of manliness or feeling, further than for their own gratification.
"Hire the stage, mum," Shakespeare said, indicating the bar counter. "Shall I help ye up?"
"You need not trouble yourself," Virgie replied, stepping upon a chair, thence upon a table, and then to the bar, where 3 chairs had been placed. Nicodemus followed, and likewise the bullwhacker Shakespeare, who had evidently assumed the self-appointed position of master of ceremonies, for he arose when the 2 singers were seated, and glanced his audience over with an important "ahem," as if to call attention to the fact that he was the central figure of the forthcoming entertainment.
"Feller citizens," he began, "this is an awe-inspirin' and sublime occasion, when with swellin' bosom of pride I am enabled to present for your approval the stars o' 2 countries, Europe and Africa, consolidated inter one stupendous aggravation. It does me proud, my noble pack o' guzzlers, to represent this great phalanx o' talent, and in commemoration o' this great occasion my poetical brain hat conceived a versical offerin', which I beg leave to precipitate at ye, as a prelude o' their caterwaulin' immediately to foller. It is entitled Der Biled Shirt, and was founded on true inserdence."
Then, clearing the big throat, the bullwhacker laid one hand dramatically across his breast, and began:
"It war 6 years ago ter-day, when Deadwood first there struck. A tenderfoot from Jarsey City togged out in spotless duck. Oh, ye bet he were a gallus pill, but of money run amuck. He waltzed inter the flush kerslap, their flask were squar for deal, though that were some who said that Pete were up to sundry steal. But I could never quite believe that Pete would stoop ter feel. Down by their board their tender sat, I seed 'twere desperate in his eye, as on his snowflake kids he spat, and said, 'Wi' me it's rocks or die.' And though no pigtail cuss were he, I tharter poor Bill Nye. Says he ter Pete, his words were low, 'Old pards, I'm broke, I have no dirt, but I'm so dry, give me a show, just go a V agin my shirt. It's biled and clean, so don't be mean, ter lose it would my feelin's hurt.' The keards was split upon their poot, and dealt the tender he were low, for Pete he held an arful hand, and scooped his jags a every show. He raked a trick for every throw. We laid the tenderfoot to rest, O arsenic he tucked a bowl, he lost the biled shirt from his breast, and then had sought another goal. We did there white, ye see, at best, we chucked him in a prospect hole."
A tremendous cheer greeted the conclusion of the bushwhacker's recitation, for the sentiment of the rude effusion hit the rough audience in a tender spot. Any man guilty of wearing a biled shirt had no sympathy from them, no matter what his troubles.
"Now we'll hear from the nigger,"
Shakespeare said, jumping down from his counter among the crowd.
"After the nigger, the gal."
"I's no nigger, sir," Nicodemus retorted, arising and glaring down at his audience.
"I's Nicodemus Johnson, a colored gentleman."
This elicited a roar of laughter, but when the darky took hold of the banjo and began to pound it in a wonderfully scientific manner, accompanying the music with burlesque songs, he held his audience spellbound. No such banjo-playing had they ever heard or seen, for he would toss the homely instrument and catch it again without interrupting the current of his playing. And besides, his songs were laughable and original absurdities, well rendered. Encore after encore greeted his artistic efforts, and each time he responded with something a little better. It was during the darky's playing that the door opened and a newcomer strode into the room. A murmur of "the captain" and "Piute Dave" passed among those who noticed his entrance, and several nodded to him, and then toward Miss Vernon, who sat beside her sable companion with a pale face and eyes that flashed with indignation at being thus forced to serve as a starting-block for a crowd of ruffians who had neither pity nor respect for womankind. Piute Dave was fully on a part with his townsmen, as far as being villainous-looking was concerned. He was a tall, heavy-set man of some 35 years, and looked like one who it would be hard to handle in a struggle. In race he was dark, bloated, and sinister, with shaggy brows, cold grey eyes of evil expression, a sensuous mouth shaded by a bristling black moustache, and a thick neck and chin, the latter ornamented with a slight goatee. He was attired in knee-boots, light-coloured trousers, red shirt open at the throat, corduroy jacket, and wide-rimmed hat, while a belt about his waist contained a brace of handsomely trimmed revolvers. He paused not far from the door, with his hands thrust in his pockets, fixed his gaze upon the girl upon the bar, a gaze intense in its evil significance. Virgie felt it, by some instinct, and turned to glance at the man, met the gaze, and then shudderingly averted her eyes. Though terrible to her were the glances of the others, the eyes of this man sent a thrill of horror through her being. She felt that in him she had a designing villain to cope with, and she was not wrong. Piute Dave was a villain, a fierce, self-willed ruffian, who hesitated at no dark and terrible deed that would further his purpose. More than one of those who had come to Death Notch to avoid Judge Lynch's noose had fallen by his hand for a trivial offence, and there was not a man in the town who did not stand in fear of him, even including the poetical Shakespeare. After his singing nearly a dozen different comic songs, the audience seemed to grow tired of Nicodemus, and a call was made for the girl to sing.
"Yes, gal, let's hear from you," the bull-whacker ordered, rubbing his hands together greedily. "You're the very nightingale what our ears acheth to hear. Give us a sort o' Methodist tune suthin', what'll make us feel solemncholy like, as my late lamented namesake Shakespeare had been known on several occasions to remark. Catch a bird on their wing, and force it to sing, and all in good time you'll have music sublime."
Virgie saw that there was nothing left for her to do but comply with the demand of her rough audience, as she was alone, with the exception of Nick, among strangers, and without defence. She had already made up her mind to get through the concert as best she could, and afterward attempt to escape from the town. Therefore, tuning her guitar, which was a fine-toned instrument, she selected a ballad from her repertory entitled "My Dear Old Mother Face," and sung it through in a sweet, pathetic voice. Every man in the room stood in utter silence as though spellbound until she had finished, when there was a tremendous outburst of applause. Rude and uncouth though the auditors, they could but appreciate the beautiful song heartily.
"Hip, hip, hooray! 3 cheers for the bar-schlangled spanner!"
"Bow, wow, wow!" at this juncture bellowed Bulldog Ben, elbowing forward from the vicinity of a temporary bar, where he had been imbibing numerous bootlegs.
"That were splendiferous, old gal. That were a regular old hymn right from Halifax. Harketh I, Bulldog Benjamin, their majestic mastiff o' Death Notch. Sweeter by far than airy essence o' Elysium. Were that old song about my old mother? I can now see her sarchin' for her nebriate son 'long the shady banks o' the Mississippi. You bettin' if ever I did noble act in my life, I'm goin' to kiss yer for remindin' their old bulldog of his old Maine bulldog. Bow, wow, wow, barketh I!"
And the ruffian bound nimbly upon the bar. Virgie sprung to her feet with a cry of horror, but before the wretch could lay a hand upon her, there was a sharp crack of a revolver, and he fell bleeding at her feet. End of Chapter 3.